Good evening. Good evening. Welcome to this edition to Policy Matters here on Intellectual Radio. You can tune in on IntellectualRadio.com or iHeart. Today, my guest is no other than the great Amara Enyia. I guess I give a little background from what I know about you. You have a very distinguished background. I think you come from a very distinguished family, and one of the things that I personally like about you is the history surrounding your father. Brothers, sisters, mother, you hold a PhD, a law degree, a triathlon, an avid bike rider, and I do believe you are the foremost progressive thinker throughout the United States on policies that affect individuals. So, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. It's good to be here.
Likewise. So we're going to dive right into it. And I think I have been able to land some pretty good interviews. And I think this is one of the most coveted interviews because I think the listeners and the viewers are really interested in what you have to say regarding the election cycle. How could we publicly engage and change the way the course of government, and what are policies that you would like to see put in place to really push that progressive agenda? The elections, and give me your take on elections pretty quickly, if we may.
Well, I mean, this most recent election had a couple of interesting things that came out. A lot of the issues that really garnered the most attention had to do with some of the hot button issues around the property tax system in Illinois. So we have a successful challenger to the incumbent Joe Berrios, who was the incumbent Cook County assessor, and Fritz Kagi, who was able to benefit, I think, from people really understanding. Number one, being aware of this issue of property taxes and the inequity in the system and how the system actually harms particularly communities of color and lower income communities. And so you had a couple of reports that came out last year through the Chicago Tribune and ProPublica and other avenues that exposed the system. That created an awareness and an opportunity for a challenger like Kagi to be able to come in, tap into the frustration and the anger that many people felt when they pay their property taxes, and to be able to challenge an incumbent who really had no response as to why the system was what it was and had no rebuttal to the indictment on the system. And so that was one of the biggest races that typically goes under the radar. I mean, the assessor is not generally one of the races people keep their eye on, but that was a big win. So that's one of the ones that came out.
Right. And so we often see with this last gubernatorial race, we saw big money, huge money. I think it was more money spent in the governor's race here in Illinois primary than actually in Donald Trump, what he spent in his presidential race. How do we fix elections and we take big money out of it to be able to everybody has a voice? Once you get big money into it, it kind of weeds out the voices of the little people. How do we fix it?
That's a question of just the need for campaign finance reform in general. And what we saw in this latest election, particularly in the gubernatorial, was that ultimately the victor, J.B. Pritzker, who's going on to the general, spent around $70 million in this election. I think the second and third place were roughly around $3 and $4 million. So there's a huge gap between what was spent. But what's even more telling is not just that the money was spent, but it's who comprised the donors. And so the front runner was basically self-funded, which tells you something about whose voices are being represented. Part of the idea of donating to a political campaign is that is the exercise of your voice. And so if you are self-funding, who are you representing becomes a question. But it's also not just for the self-funding, it's also who's funding. So if you have one of the things that came out of the Bernie Sanders race was the fact that it was small donors across the country who donated $27, $30 to the campaign. And what that tells you is you have this broad array of people who are actually supporting a candidate. it's going to be difficult, and it's getting increasingly difficult for any challenger to come in who does not have deep pockets, or who does not have access to deep pockets. And it's troubling on a number of fronts. One, because it does bring to bear whose voices get prioritized. And two, it in an age where we have Citizens United, which essentially gives corporations a voice, we're moving more toward a place where average residents, average citizens who may not have the capacity to max out in donations to political campaigns are seeing their voices diminished. What I think we should be looking at is the fact that it's an issue across the board, whether you're a Republican or whether you're a Democrat. And we can criticize President Trump for however he financed his campaign or however he won or however much he spent. But we should also be able to criticize the Democratic Party when we see that same thing happening. And the goal should be, with campaign finance reform across the board, that actually makes sure that regular people are not drowned out because of either incredibly wealthy self-funded candidates or corporations that dominate.
Right. So, and you said a lot right there. And one of the things that kind of stick out in my mind is you said regular people, and regular people, black male from the age of 19 to 35 is 9 times more likely to be shot and killed by the police than anybody else. And we hear Eddie Johnson made a statement regarding the shooting of Betty Jones and the other young man who was shot here. And we saw in San Francisco, young man was shot at 20 times. I do believe 8 bullets hit him. We see this large array of African-American males getting shot throughout the country. How can we reverse that trend? What can we do to make an impact in seeing black men get shot across the country?
Well, it really is. It's reversing the trend. It's really eliminating the instances of this happening. And I will incorporate Black women who've also been shot. I mean, many people who've been shot, Black women, Black men, people of color in general. The disparity in terms of who falls victim to police violence as opposed to who doesn't is very obvious. And a lot of the conversations have talked about every extreme. So you have a faction that wants to abolish the police. You have a faction and then you can go all the way to the other side where there are those who claim that there's nothing wrong and that sort of apologists for these incidents. And what it really boils down to is that there's no one magic bullet, but what we know can mitigate this and eliminate it, which should be the goal, is that accountability and transparency are two of the biggest things. Whenever we talk about these incidents, it is about first within the department holding themselves accountable. And that has to take place at all levels. And so a lot of instances where we saw some of these things happening, there were these lapses in accountability. And if you live in the city of Chicago for any number of years, we know historically, I mean, we just paid reparations to families that were victims of police torture in the city of Chicago, right? But those things are allowed to happen when the internal, because they create accountability for officers amongst themselves and within the department, are lapsed. So there has to be that internal accountability first and foremost. A lot of times they'll talk about the danger or the hesitance of being a police officer who exposes these sorts of things, or who exposes it. But that is absolutely essential to make sure that before anything gets out to the public, the public has to know that the police department will address these issues in a timely fashion, in a thorough fashion. There are legislative mechanisms that can be put in place to enhance that accountability and particularly transparency. A lot of these details are being negotiated right now with the Fraternal Order of Police contract, which is up and being negotiated as we speak. Things like how long records can be held, how long an individual's record, a police officer's record, can be held, right? If it's 5 years, does it need to be longer? How do we determine patterns of behavior from police officers? And all of these things, especially around transparency and accountability, should be done with the understanding that the job is extremely difficult. The job is extremely difficult and can be extremely dangerous. However, as state-sanctioned actors, there is a higher standard that they have to be held to, because you are an actor of the state. And so that means that there is more that has to be done to make sure that we don't have instances where individuals are being shot, and not just the being shot, but the aftermath. There's no accountability. There's no one to answer to those things that are happening.
Okay, and you pushed accountability and transparency, and one of the things that makes it reminds me of is that the Laquan McDonald case, when I heard a group of aldermen said we was misled and there was no transparency in the payout of that, and you also have an individual that was maybe used as the scapegoat, and he chooses now to run for mayor of the city of Chicago. And I do believe his name is Gary McCarthy. So we have a race coming up in the near future, and we got some people jumping into it. And you got Gary, and you got Ram, and you got some other individuals, and some names been thrown out and different things like that. So it cautions me for a person to get into a race based upon an axe to grind or legitimately want to make the change. So what do you feel about the recent highlight about Mr. McCarthy jumping into the race?
Well, the city of Chicago, the issues that we face in the city, and even more so the potential of the city, requires visionary leadership that actually understands where we can go and what it will take to get us there. And so as we're thinking about what leadership in the city looks like, the question for anyone who is putting themselves forth should be, first and foremost, what do we envision? What do we want on my block, in my neighborhood, on my side of town, in the city as a whole? And then who exhibits the characteristics necessary to get us there? This sort of top-down approach of saying, why this person is ideal, or a person coming out and saying why they want. I mean, yes, in a democracy, you can run. That's one of the benefits of being in a democracy, is that anyone can, as long as they fit whatever the criteria are, can run for office. But I think the onus is on the people to articulate a vision, and then the leadership, which is in this context is actually a public servant who fits the criteria necessary to serve the public according to the vision that we have. And so that, to me, is the most important criteria, regardless of who gets in the race. You will not have the kind of visionary leadership if it's premised upon narrow ideals or a narrow agenda. It has to really encompass the potential of the city, understand the complexity and the issues of the entire city, and then have the vision and the solutions that resonate with the people.
Wow. That's deep. You talk the vision and the leadership, and I think that's real deep. So in the beginning, I introduce you as the foremost progressive thinker throughout. Right? That's what I believe. I know that you hold to certain convictions, and when I first met you, you said something that was very powerful to me, and it was very simple, but it was very powerful. You said reinvesting in human capital. And I think that's one of the key things that's been missing throughout our country, throughout our leadership, throughout our, capital, throughout government, period. How do we put that reinvestment back into the areas that it needs to be invested? One way to stop a bullet is with a job. So how do we take that investment and go forth?
It has to be intentional. And so what we have seen in this city is a level of inequity that is not by happenstance. And I think people, or sometimes there's this notion that some of this happens by accident, when in actuality, there is intentionality behind it, for good or for bad. And so when we look at, this week, it's the 50th anniversary of the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And if you look at what happened right after his assassination, particularly on the west side of Chicago, 1968, and the riots that decimated the west side of the city. And if you fast forward to today, much of the remains and much of the aftermath of that is still occurring. When you look at the vacant lots, the vacant land, the businesses that disappeared, and it's not even just the physical evidence of what happened in 68. It's the fact that if you look at the population of neighborhoods like East Garfield Park, where prior to, maybe I believe in the 70s, where the median income was around 37,000, now it's fallen 17,000, right? You look at a population that at its peak was near past 30,000, and now it's down to 17,000, 11,000. Communities are essentially bottoming out. If you look at the rates of home ownership that have declined, so you have a high transient population in many of these areas. And so some people will say, well, that's just the way it is. But I argue that investment has to be intentional via public policy, with the same intentionality, for example, that certain people, particularly Black people, were redlined, so they were not able to get access to the bank loans, which was a vehicle through which other families could purchase homes. Well, homes are a part of building wealth. So if you cannot get access to a loan because banks would not give you a loan, then how can you purchase a home? Therefore, how can you amass wealth, right? The same thing goes for business ownership. If you can't get access to capital to launch a business, well, you can't build wealth. And so there were intentional public policies that were sanctioned at the city level and even at the federal level that kept Black people in particular from being able to access the avenues to wealth creation. And so I argue that those same mechanisms can be used to facilitate the same kind of wealth building that other communities have exhibited. If you look at in the city of Chicago where growth happens, there are targeted areas of the city that are planned. I mean, the city is planned. It's a planned city. So nothing happens by accident. The areas that are targeted for investment are the areas that receive the investment. And so it stands to reason that the areas that are crumbling, the areas that are blighted, they are not seen as part of a plan for investing. What we have to understand is that as a city, if we do not more equitably invest our dollars, it actually hurts the city as a whole. It's convenient for many people to say, well, that's those people over on that side of town, or that's those people over there. It doesn't affect me, but it does. And it affects us because when we don't invest in those areas, we close their schools, there are no businesses in the area, the homeowners leave, people have left. That actually hits our bottom line financially. So we're not collecting in property tax revenue. We're not the businesses in an area. If there's no foot traffic for the business, those businesses will suffer. The institutions suffer. So this disinvestment has a residual effect that overall depresses the potential of Chicago's economy. And the only way to make sure that we reach our greatest potential is by equitably allocating resources, particularly in areas that have been ignored, quite frankly, for decades.
Girl, that was a mouthful. That was a mouthful. And one of the things I want to say about that is that during this King riots, and many people had said that that we set the streets on fire, but that didn't happen. I know part of my family and individuals that was there. A lot of those business owners saw a way out, insurance wise, and they set those places on fire. And it was also part of the police plan to kind of contain the individuals so it wouldn't get out. Keep them in their neighborhood, burn up their neighborhood. They stay there. And you very so right that Lawndale, Garfield, Austin, many communities throughout the city of Chicago where large minorities live haven't had seen any economic development since the 60s. Whatever reasons. And it really breaks down to one reason to me. And I think it's just real simple: systematic racism. Mm-hmm. And we have it in many different areas. You talked about the school closing. You talked about the mental health closing, the grocery stores and small business loans. And you have Black individuals that's trying to start businesses and can't get redlined. They did it with property, and they did it in other communities. So I know it goes on. One of the things I wanted to ask you, so you said this vision, this leadership, this accountability, transformity. And one of the things I know that was unique to you that many people may not know it, but you gave a bid uh, 2015 for what's the name for mayor of the city of Chicago, and you had this platform, and it was a very progressive platform. And myself was a candidate in the last cycle, and I heard that platform be turned into a soundbite. So tell me about some of those pieces, the transaction tax, the progressive income tax, and different things like that.
So it's the interesting thing is a lot of the policies that I had pushed previously had become front and center issues in the most recent gubernatorial. But the reality is that when we talk about what it means to be progressive, a lot of times you hear a lot of rhetoric around it, but in terms of policies that are set forth, it doesn't always translate into that. And so for years, I've worked on pushing a policy agenda that reflects those values. And so I've worked on state legislation around this public bank. And I'm part of a national group actually that works across the country in cities and states around the country, implementing a public bank strategy based upon the North Dakota model across the country. And so the most recent example of a big win was in New Jersey, the new governor-elect Phil Murphy, who had a public bank as the centerpiece of his economic platform, and he won. And this is absolutely transformative for the state's economy. I had pushed it at the local level for a municipal bank, which has a transformative impact because of what it does to have a financial institution whose sole goal is to spur economic growth for the city of Chicago. It addresses all of the issues that we have now where we're borrowing money at rates that are astronomical to where we're mortgaging off our future essentially because of fines and because of fees to banks. We were engaged in toxic swaps for several years, which cost hundreds of millions of dollars. If you look at our investments in infrastructure and infrastructure projects, we pay probably 40 to 50% over the cost of any infrastructure projects just in fees to those traditional financial institutions alone. And so something like a public bank for the city of Chicago would be transformative for the economy, brings in revenue, addresses a lot of the waste that we've seen with how we engage with traditional financial institutions. And it's something that is very doable and is in fact being done across the country, but we're not doing it here. And so that's a big push. I also talk a lot and have worked a lot in this issue of around cooperative economics and cooperative models. That includes everything from worker-owned cooperatives, housing cooperatives, community land trusts, because the best way to address a lot of what we see in the communities is through ownership, and ownership builds wealth. And so instead of just limiting ourselves to the traditional business ownership model, imagine what we can do if we collectively own businesses. If the employees at a local gas station or local dry cleaners were also the owners. Imagine what we could do if we owned the land in our communities. The first rule of urban planning, any urban planner will tell you, is who owns the land. If we own the land in those communities, how then can we use that land to generate wealth with a community-driven agenda? This is how you combat gentrification and essentially displacement, because that's what we're really talking about. How communities are being, individuals and families that are pushed out, they're essentially priced out of their communities. You have to have ownership. So cooperative models is a mechanism to get that, and actually would expand and strengthen the city's economic ecosystem. And so earlier this year, I launched the Institute for Cooperative Economics and Economic Innovation, and it has been met with a lot of enthusiasm by people who are imagining an economy that actually works for everyone, and an economy that builds self-sufficiency and builds wealth, particularly in challenged areas, but really across the board. So that's just a couple of examples of some of the policies that I've put forth that are progressive, but it hasn't always been. We're at a point where the landscape is more conducive to them. But years ago, when I was talking about these issues, there was more work to educate the public. But I think we've reached a tipping point where the public is ready for actual solutions. We know many of the issues that exist. What people want are the solutions. How do we fix it? How do we change it? What do we do? And that's what I'm continuing to push.
Great, great. I think you that's it. That's it. I hear you saying about small businesses and individuals in the community owning the businesses, and they're more likely to stick there. When you get individuals coming outside the community own the businesses, that's when the community change and bottom line, gentrification happens.
Mhm.
People lose their home. Prices go up. They can't afford it. And with this, well, we got a new assessor now, but that was one of the ways that people lost their home. They just couldn't afford it, and they lost them with taxes and
Yeah.
different things like that. Those type of mechanisms. So, talked a lot, said a lot. It's a lot of hot button questions and different things like that. What is on the horizon?
So I again launched the Institute for Cooperative Economics and Economic Innovation. This is in partnership with Blue Lacuna. So the founder is Emil Cambry. We've worked together on a lot of things, particularly around workforce development and training people for the economy of tomorrow. And so we launched earlier this year. The goal is threefold. One, educate the public as to cooperative economic models, whether they're worker-owned, housing co-ops, land trusts, just across the board. We want to make sure that we're educating the public as to the power and potential of this to strengthen our economy. The second is to provide technical assistance. So we're actually going to be helping to launch new cooperative enterprises throughout the city and hopefully the county as well. And we will also be working to convert existing businesses to that model. So existing traditional businesses that want to convert to a cooperative model, we want to provide technical assistance to help them do that. And then the third piece is legislative and policy work. So we will be working at the city level, the county, and the state level to draft policy and law, essentially, that creates a pathway for these models to thrive. That absolutely has to be done. And that requires working with decision makers to create the environment where these models can grow and thrive.
So I hear you saying all of that. Now, what about if decision makers are not willing? I know we got to change the decision makers then. So I know bottom line, and we have to civically engage people to make those changes that's necessary to bring about the changes that we need within our society. And I thank you for drawing the clear cut picture. I think you eloquently say it and lay it out, break it down where the common man can see it, because I say, hey, we need more black businesses. We need more business of people of Hispanic descent in their community and, whatever community it is. And we need that. And a lot of times in the African American community, we don't see businesses that look like us. And I'm always thrilled to see businesses and different venues that look like us. And I know you have been very innovative in bringing about those businesses and those changes. And I hope you continue those things and maybe on a greater scale. And we may see more things coming up in the horizon for you. I know we almost out of town. We do have a sponsor today. So I just must always give him a plug because I think he is the greatest designer. He does my suits. His name is Paul Galante. He's of Paul Fashion. He'll be here from April the 7th to April the 10th. He has a website and it's MikeGalante.com. And his phone number is area code 310-754-5885. Join us next week on this edition of Policy Matters here on Intellectual Radio. Thank you again, Amara. I really appreciate you coming. You must come back and let us know what you're doing.
Yes, of course. Thank you.